invented the American art form, the animated feature. This is the Tam O'Shanter Inn down the hill from Disney's Burbank Studios, where Walt would regularly take his 9 old men to lunch. I hope he let them order anything they wanted, because their art and their genius have helped us all live happier ever after. The 9 old men were Les Clark, Eric Larson, Wolfgang Reitherman, Ward Kimball, Milt Kahl, Frank Thomas, Ollie Johnston, John Lounsbery, Marc Davis. To celebrate the astounding achievements of these pioneers in the art of animation, we've gathered together some of today's top talents in the world of animation who knew, worked with, and were mentored by one or more of Disney's 9 old men. This is the table. This is the table where Walt and the 9 old men would have lunch. And when you were a kid, was there a moment in a Disney feature that really affected you? Part one of the question. And part two, how did you feel when you met the person who had created that?
Certainly for me, one of the big things was seeing Sleeping Beauty as a kid. It was released in '59 originally, and fight with the dragon and the prince and the thorns and all that. And that was Wooly Reitherman, one of the 9 old men who really supervised that. Years later, when I started the studio, Wooly, this sort of craggy, bow-legged, you know, swashbuckler of a guy, seeing this guy who really had sort of created this great work of art, really, it was, you know, a little bit of a disconnect. This is the guy who did that whole thing with the, you know, the dramatic impact.
There was that moment of quiet where the two adversaries were tensing, and you hopefully didn't quite know what was going to happen.
Pinocchio came out around that time, and that it was, in some ways, maybe even a bigger impact. And that was a lot of the 9 old men, you know, Frank and Ollie and all those guys really bringing that to life. And Brad actually knew Milt Kahl from, what, 13 or something like that?
Yeah. I learned a lot from him, but I kind of had to get it from his sputterings and from his drawings. So, you know, I got to do this scene, and I was very impressed with myself. I had it, and it was moved pretty good. And I showed it to this guy who was in charge of bringing in new talent. And he looked at it and he goes, "Oh, that's pretty good," you know. And then he started chuckling, and I'm like, "What's wrong?" You know, I'm thinking very highly of myself. And he goes, "Milt's gonna rip the expletive out of this," you know. And so I went in and I'd show it to him, and he'd kind of go, "Geez, you didn't even explore the possibilities here. You know, you could have done this, or you could have done that."
I don't think it's possible to be a top-notch animator without being a very excellent draftsman. You have to be able to draw these characters in order to move them around and articulate them, you know. So there's no way of doing it unless you draw very well.
I'd come out of there like, "Oh my God," you know, I have so much to learn. And that was actually a really good thing for me.
But Eric Larson was the mentor of many of us at the studio.
Almost everyone went through Eric at some point, because he was kind of the first person that you worked with, even as you were doing personal tests when you began at Disney in the training program. He was the teacher.
I found in the cat, in the kitten, something that was warm, and the job, of course, was to make him come alive as a personality. So what do? You say, well, how old is he? All right, he's a spunky 4-year-old kid or 3-year-old kid, whatever you want. How will they react in given conditions and in certain situations?
Actually, Cinderella was a film that was kind of very, very pivotal to me, as well as The Reluctant Dragon, which I remember going to a camp, Indian guide camp for a weekend, and there's a great scene where Robert Benchley gets lost in the studio, and it's, you know, behind the scenes. And he goes into the animators room, and there's Ward Kimball. He's finishing up the drawing of Goofy, you know, puts it on this stack of paper, picks it up and flips it, starts whistling, and Goofy starts dancing around. I was just like, the bug took a big bite, you know, the animation bug.
Artist always goes back to the source. If he's drawing animals, he looks at the giraffes and the lions, and he caricatures them, but he starts out drawing realistically. Like on Bambi, the guys used to go down at the zoo and see how the animals acted.
The one that kind of clicked into me was Jungle Book, and I think it was because it's not the strongest story they ever did, but the acting, I think, is at the very pinnacle of any film acting done in animation. There's acting performances left and right. Baloo feeling the heaviness of having to tell Mowgli that he has to take him back. The imperiousness of Shere Khan.
And also the art in that scene, the way the tiger is coming in, lying down, the way he's drawn. When he's doing this scene, you know, and he's looking at this antelope, and he's doing with just the shoulder shift. I mean, how powerful is that? You know, that is just an absolutely awesome scene. And Ollie Johnston, I'm sure he told you guys this too. He said this years and years ago to me. He said, don't animate drawings, animate feelings. Yeah. And it took me about a decade to understand what he really meant. Because you think, as a young animator, what is he talking about? You animate drawings. You draw, and those are going to be animated. But I think he was talking about more of about internalizing the character, feeling the character, and then drawing it.
The key to these characters is making them think, and making the expressions on their face that register what they're thinking, what their feelings are, what's going on in the mind. And I think that's the key to Disney animation, and what Walt always asked for.
I went to John Lounsbery with a scene to have him take a look at it. Very quiet, gentle guy. And what was surprising is the person seemed so reserved and very encouraging in his comments about my drawings. And then I'd look at his drawings, and they were bold, powerful. I mean, this guy drew with such conviction, and he drew with these big pencils. They were thick layout pencils, because the point was thick. You pull the string, and you get more lead. And after he died, he was the first of the 9 old men to pass away at that point.
76 or something, yeah.
And I mean, it was shocking, because I think all of those 9 old men realized this is going to go away someday. But anyway, I bought all the pencils I could of that. They don't make them anymore. I've got a whole stack of them in my drawer.
But John Lounsbery was a brilliant draftsman. He did, in Lady and the Tramp, he did Tony and Joe and brought these guys completely to life.
And the dad
and Peter Pan. And after all, he worked on Lucifer and the Mice, I think, with Kimball. I think he was in that group, yeah. And so he did some great comedy stuff. I think he might have done the stuff with Lucifer, drinking the milk and stuff, I think.
Les is trickier, because Les, I don't think, maybe I don't know that any of us actually worked with Les.
I know, Les's big scenes was in Snow White, where the Snow White is dancing with the dwarfs, and they're stacked up on top of each other, and it's really an amazingly sort of complex scene that he did.
He goes furthest back and did some of the Mickey Mouses early, that kind of laid pipe for personality animation that went into then Snow White, and so he was really an early kind of
I remember, I was in
pioneer.
the Annie Awards ceremony with Les Clark's widow, and there was a picture of Walt up there with the drawing of Mickey or whatever, and she was like, Les did that drawing, you know.
I think it was on my 6th birthday. The family got into the car and went to a drive-in movie. And this is the ultimate test for any film. Can it stand up inside of this family station wagon with 7 people jammed into this thing on a little tin box, kind of, you know, through a windshield. And I was always kind of between my brother and the sister, and my mom and dad sitting in the front, with Jeff kind of like, I had to reach over his head and look, and the thing is all steamed up. But when Cruella de Vil, because it was 101 Dalmatians, when she came on, if you were going to animate it, this little kid went, he's not in the car anymore. He's living completely frightened of this witch woman that came in. And you mentioned it, Cruella de Vil, her name Devil.
Yeah,
I'd never realized that till today.
Come on.
Really? No. It was Cruella from the city, the cruel lady from the city. That's all I
thought she was named after a Cadillac. Honestly, it wasn't until as an adult watching with in my 50s, watching with my little boy, I saw the license plate, D-E-V-I. Wow.
When I then came to the studio and met Marc Davis, who did that character, he was the total opposite of Cruella de Vil in figure. But the sense of taste, that was a guy who really savored life. And you could see it in his animation. It was a sensual character, the touch and the feel, of a coat. And I kind of expected to get all kinds of secrets from him. But you found out it was just through hard work. None of these guys had any big secrets.
There aren't any big secrets. It's hard work.
It's just really hard work. I just remember him saying, "And again." And then he would state some principle. And again. And when I think about Marc Davis, it's the one thing, that phrase, "and again," meaning if you're going to get good at something, you got to do it over and over and over and over again and never quit.
When you look at that face on the screen and the whole face works together, when you smile, the eyes smile, the mouth smiles, your ears even move. This is something, when we do it right, the whole thing lights up, and it's like a magic lantern. You see this face, and it's living.
I was such a fan of like Disney and the Sunday night show, and I would go peek through the fence when I was a kid. When I got my driver's license, it was the first place I went to. I would go and literally look through the fence and see the Zorro set or whatever was going on behind the scenes. But I was a musician. I came to animation because I loved music and I loved art, and I drew a little bit and I played music a lot. And when I got a chance to come to the studio, one of my first jobs was working with Wolfgang Reitherman, and then at lunchtime all these guys would play on the soundstage. And one of my earliest movie memories was they play instruments. It was like the remnants of the Firehouse Five, which was a Dixieland band that Frank Thomas played in, and Ward Kimball, and all these really great guys. And that's when I learned these guys had all these multiple interests. They were adults. They weren't just, guys that were geeks and cartoonists and sat there and drew all day. Frank was this great Dixieland piano player, and Ward was this great trombone player, and I got to play drums with him, which was like a highlight of my life. And I realized that those are the moments that I loved in Disney movies. I loved Peter Pan when Hook comes out and plays the piano to Tinkerbell. And I thought, God, what kind of an animation assignment was that? Because it's like, all right, we got this little fairy that doesn't say anything, and we have a villain that has a hook for a hand. Can you have him sit at the piano and play a tune? Who did that? And then I was at the drive-in theater too, parked next to Glenn, in my car, and loved, like, 101 Dalmatians, completely swept away by that movie by Cruella, by Roger, because he played the piano right. Huh. And I later found out it was Frank again. It was the same guy.
As one animator said, thinking back on those days, it said it looked like every last frame of film was manicured. Someone had just worked over to pack every last thing you could into it, and they had.
One of the things that amazed me reading about Walt Disney, reading about the history of the studio, and reading about the history of the art form, is that when he was working on Snow White, one of his biggest fears, and the question he asked would audiences be able to emotionally connect with the drawing?
I think the thing that surprised Hollywood was how emotionally engaged they got in the characters, and the scene that really brought that home was Frank Thomas's scenes of the dwarves crying over Snow White's body. And
to see those dwarves come up and take off their hats and get down on their knees and then back away, everybody in that theater was crying. I heard the sobs. I couldn't believe it. Biggest stars in Hollywood, you name, were all wiping the tears out of their eyes.
And I was so impressed because the people that I'd always admired and thought, gee, these are my gods, they're so good. They wanted to meet me.
Let's say they're working on Cinderella. What would they be talking about here over lunch?
Well, I think that historically the studio was at a transitional point. They hadn't done features for years. The war had kind of killed off their foreign markets. And a lot of the films that are now adjusted for inflation, the most successful of all, were not on their original release. Bambi, Pinocchio, Fantasia. And they were really talking seriously about closing the studio down. And Roy was kind of saying, look, Walt, we can get our money out, we can retire comfortably. And Walt was like, no, we got to start it up again. And I think that all of the team was very grateful to be working on a feature again, because they had been away from it since Bambi.
They were 9 young men at that point. Even though they called them the 9 old men, they were still pretty young when they
You got to remember that at that point there was still a lot of future to come, and they didn't know that. They didn't know that. They were still just figuring out this. Only recently had they been discovering the potential for acting, and every one of them wanted to go deeper. They wanted that chance to get to that emotional core of a character. And I mean, I think if I was them and I was sitting around here, you'd be wanting to find a way to get deeper into your character. For Ward, how can I really get this wickedness of this cat? I mean, there's this moment where it lifts the cup and You know, he just does this little. You know, I just would have loved to have been there to talk about with Ward at that point. You know, like, what were you thinking there? I mean, why do that? Where does that come from?
Well, I always read it as ecstatic joy at being mean. When he has to do any other function, the cat is very
so
kind of
blasé,
casual and blasé and lethargic.
Yeah.
But anytime he has a chance to screw somebody up, he's like, yeah!
I checked out a scene of Ward Kimball's animation on Cinderella, and it had some of his rough notes on the scene, and he had done the mice in the scene, and Cinderella was also in the scene. But the note to his assistants was, "The Stooge enters here." The Stooge was Cinderella. So I think he had a certain attitude toward the straighter characters that Glenn was describing. That was like, you know, he lived for the comedy and you know the counterpoint to the
Someone else
sentiment.
that people don't, I think, talk about enough is Wooly Reitherman. He did a lot of the stuff on the stairs, didn't he?
Right, yeah. He
Which
did
is
the mice going up the
brilliantly
stairs.
staged.
Unbelievable.
And you are so rooting for these guys to make it. And the fact that they cut to these points of view where you see this endless staircase from the mice's point of view, it just makes it an incredible obstacle that has to be surmounted. And an audience just gets bent out of shape when they finally make it there and the cat covers them up. The audience goes, ah! You know, because they so want it. So when it finally gets delivered to them, it is the most satisfying thing.
Especially the stepmother. I mean, Frank's stepmother is just something
very
else.
cool.
You have a character who doesn't move very much, but she is so psychologically strong, you know, and powerful and cruel to Cinderella that I was at a point thinking, Cinderella, run away.
Cinderella was being handled as a real girl. The stepsisters as cartoon real girls. The mice were cartoons, the cat was cartoon, the horse, the dog, all of them were cartoon characters. But the thing that made the picture work was the stepmother. She was the force through the whole thing. She had to be believable. She had to look real to the audience, even though she was far from real. And she had to match in drawing Cinderella and the stepsisters.
If you were talking to the 9 old men, what would you say to them, and what would they say to you?
I'd say,
Do
get
better.
to work.
Yeah, really. I think they would be taskmasters, and some tougher than others. But I think they always held things to such a high standard. And even as we made films, they were always supportive, but never, I would say, like, yeah, you've done it.
The way things get to be really good is to be really critical and always keep pushing them to be as good as they possibly can be. And if you start thinking, yeah, we got it, I mean, you're in big trouble.
It was like, you know, we did some amazing things back there, and you should do better than we did, and you absolutely.
That's exactly what Walt said to them. He was very
They were
sparing
just repeating
with
it.
praise.
When we finished Lion King, we had Frank and Ollie came to the El Capitan, and we sat them in the front row. And we said, "Oh, they were going to love this. It's going to be fantastic," and they did. But they had that little aura of, I have a few notes. You know, there's a few things I could do, and I love that about them because they were never satisfied. And I think that's like.
Well, they weren't satisfied with their own work. Why would they be satisfied with ours?
But they were always encouraging, you know. And Wooly Reitherman wrote in my book, he said, Andreas, take animation a step further. And I'm going like, my gosh, more than what you guys have done?
No pressure there.
At all, you know. But then you realize if I just make it personal, it'll be at least different. It probably won't be as good, but maybe it'll be a little different.
And they never lost their enthusiasm. Over the years that I've gotten to know them, they were just, even though they weren't doing it themselves, they were always enthusiastic about what we were doing.
Frank and Ollie were just, you know, for me, it's like being an actor and getting to talk to Brando. I took the Incredibles story reels over to their place, and physically they're in their 90s now and can't move around a lot, so I would take stuff to them and you know, go ahead, lay into me, guys, you know. But you know, right up to the very end, I was wanting to hear what they had to say.
Eric used to say, one word, the Disney films had sincerity. There wasn't a cynicism about them. And that manifests itself in a lot of ways. It was an expression of acting or storytelling or whatever, but there was always this sense of honesty about the films. They had huge interest too. I mean, that's the thing. Like going back to Wooly, he was a fighter pilot and decorated by the Air Force. And Marc Davis collected New Guinea artwork and had this huge collection. So they were these sophisticated guys. Eric was interested in architecture, and I think the fact that the Depression happened and Walt kind of pulled them all together was really this amazing moment in history that all these guys came together, and they weren't just these kind of hobbyists that drew things on the back of their notebooks and stuff. They were men, sophisticated people who had world interests, and they brought all that to their work, and I think that's why their work is so lasting.
Well, I think one of the key things too that they taught me is to not look at other animation. They said you can learn a few things from that. They said, but what's more important is to take from your life, either take from books that you've read, something outside the art form, and make your own observations and bring them to the art form, because then the art form's always growing. And they brought from their lives, so if we follow that example and bring from our lives, the art form's going to continue to expand.
Well, I think it's no question for all of us that we wouldn't be sitting at this table at the beautiful Tam O'Shanter without these 9 guys that kind of inspired all of us, and more importantly, inspired our audience. They never talked down to the audience. They adored the audience and had this great way of communicating with them, and the audience loved them, and we're all here because of them. So to the 9 old men.
To the 9 old men.
To the 9 old men. Cheers.
Cheers. Cheers.
Our point was to animate, and the term